Hey everyone, as I mentioned in my previous post, this will be kind of the standard moving forward. So, tonight's story is called The Cabinet Was Locked from the Inside. Story about a salvage diver from a stretch of Louisiana bayou called Devil's Cut. It's about a man named Theo. He's 43. He runs a bait shop in a town that nobody's ever heard of. He takes a job he shouldn't have taken in the same water his grandfather drowned in decades before. The boat's in 12 feet of dark water. The cabin door is sealed from the inside. What happens when he goes down there? Well, you're gonna have to listen to find out. Thank you. Enjoy. Headphones recommended.
Slack water is the worst thing the bayou can do. My grandfather taught me that before I could read. He'd put a finger to the surface of the cut behind his house and say, "Wait." Then he'd say, "There." The water would stop moving. Just for a second, sometimes longer. The cypress shadows locked into place. The dragonflies would land on the lily pads and not lift again until he moved his finger. And he would say, "Slack water, Theo. Look at it. Remember." I asked him what was so bad about it. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "The bayou is always thinking, son. Slack water means the bayou has stopped thinking. And when the bayou stops thinking, it's because something else is doing the thinking for it." I was 6 years old. I didn't understand a word of it. I thought it sounded like the kind of thing grandfathers say when they want to be remembered. 3 years later, he drowned in a stretch of water called Devil's Cut, off the southwest fork of Bayou Marchand, about 19 miles from the dock where his pirogue had been moored the night before. They never found him. They found the pirogue. They found his pipe still wedged in the crook of the bow where he kept it. They found a coil of rope and his old buck knife and the brown paper sack he had taken his lunch in. They did not find my grandfather. I am 43 years old. Last Tuesday I came up out of Devil's Cut into slack water that had no right to be there. The cypress I had tied off to was gone. The channel I had come in by was gone. Below me, 12 feet down, the boat I had been hired to recover was sitting on the bottom of the cut, and its cabin door was sealed from the inside with 4 deadbolts I had seen with my own eyes through the porthole. And the seal was beginning to give. I could feel the water shift around me when it gave, the way water shifts when something big has decided to move. I want to start before the dive. There's a lot to say before the dive, and if I tell it backward, I lose the part of myself that lived through the first half of it, the Theo who took the job, the Theo who didn't know yet, the Theo who thought slack water was just something his grandfather had said. The call came in on a Friday afternoon. I was at the bait shop. The bait shop is half mine, and half belongs to my cousin Marcel, who lives 2 parishes inland and does not work it. But his name is on the deed, because he put up $4,000 when I needed $4,000, and we never bothered to refinance. The shop sits on a piling dock at the south end of Petit Roule, which is a town in the sense that it has a post office and a gas station with 2 pumps and an empty Catholic church that lost its priest after the spill, and a Dollar General that came in 3 years back and is the only place to buy a toothbrush within 20 miles. I was repacking a tray of frozen shrimp when the phone rang. The phone is the original cradle phone wired into the wall behind the counter, beige plastic. Curly cord that has been replaced twice and is again beginning to twist into the kind of mess you cannot fix once it has gone that way. The phone rings rarely. Most of my charter business comes through word of mouth, and most of my salvage work comes from a regional adjuster named Verlon Doucet, who I have known since I was running airboat tours in my 20s. The voice on the other end was not Verlon. It said, "Is this Theo Boudreau?" I said, "It is." It said, "My name is Marsh Bork, calling from Tidewater Indemnity in Port Aubrey. I want to discuss a salvage assignment. Are you available to talk?" I said I was. I leaned against the counter. The tray of shrimp was sweating on the wood between my hand and the receiver. I could smell them. Old shrimp on a hot day smells like the bayou wants to smell on the bayou's worst days. I made a mental note to dump that tray. Bork told me about the boat. A 38-foot Bertram Sportfish, registered out of Port Aubrey, owned by the estate of a man named Reynolds, who had died last year of cancer. The boat had been in storage for 9 months on a trailer in Reynolds' driveway. Sometime in March it had been moved by parties unknown and dropped into the bayou at a put-in nobody used. It had been recovered after a fashion 2 weeks ago by an aerial survey that spotted its outline in shallow water, sitting upright, cabin closed, 12 feet of water. 12 feet, I said. 12 feet, Bork said. Easy depth. It would be easy depth in a clear pond. It is not easy depth in Devil's Cut, where the visibility on a good day is 6 inches, and on most days is the inside of a closed eye. I told him that. He said he understood. He said the bottom was soft, and the boat would be silt covered now. He said the insured value was $320,000. He said the estate's attorney had filed a claim and that the underwriter wanted the boat brought up before they paid out, because if they paid out and then the boat came up later with damage that hadn't been disclosed, they would have to chase the estate for reimbursement, and the estate was already in probate dispute, and they did not want to chase anyone. He said the underwriter was willing to pay a recovery diver $8,000 for a successful raise, $4,000 for a documented attempt with photographs of the wreck. $8,000. I want to be clear about what $8,000 meant to me at that moment. I owed Sarah $2,600 for our daughter's orthodontia, which had been due in January. I owed Hank Therio at the Marina $900 for the slip lease, which had been due in February. I had a transmission on the F-150 that was making a sound a transmission should not make, and that would have to be addressed before summer. I had a bait shop where the freezer compressor was on its last legs and was $1,000 on a good day. And I had a daughter, Camille, who was 12, and had asked me last month if she could go to a horseback riding camp in July that cost $640, including the bus. I had not told her yes yet. I said, "Tell me about the location." Bork told me. He used the words Devil's Cut. He used them the way a man uses a word he has only read on a map, carefully, with the wrong stress. He said Devil's Cut. Local pronunciation is closer to devils, 2 syllables that want to be one. I told him I would call him back. I hung up. I stood with my hand on the receiver for a long time. The shrimp were sweating. A truck went past on the road, and the bait shop windows rattled in their frames the way they always do when a truck goes past. Out on the dock, my old lab, Gumbo, was lying in the strip of shade under the bait freezer. He raised his head when the truck went past and laid it back down. I had not been into Devil's Cut in 31 years. The last time I was anywhere near Devil's Cut, I was 12, and I had hiked up the access road behind my grandfather's old camp because I wanted to see the place where he had died. I had stood at the put-in. I had not gone past it. There is a story about Devil's Cut. There are several stories about Devil's Cut, and depending on who you ask, you will hear different ones. Some of them are about a logging crew that went into Clear Cypress in 1923 and didn't come out. Some of them are about a Cajun trapper named Estienne Pelletier, who lived there alone for 40 years and would tie copper bells to the cypress around his cabin to listen for what came out of the water at night. Most of them are about people who had no business being in the cut, who went in anyway and were never heard from again. My grandfather, who was a man who told me other things plainly, would not talk about Devil's Cut. The first and only time I asked him, when I was 7, he looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Don't ask me that, Theo. Anything else you want to know about the bayou, you ask me. Not that." A year and a half later, he went up the cut alone and he never came back, and we got his pirogue back but not him, and that was that. I called Bork back 20 minutes later. I said I would do the job. We agreed on terms. He emailed me a contract through the bait shop's old laptop, which took the email and then froze for 10 minutes the way it does. I printed it on the inkjet that needs new cartridges. I signed it. I scanned it back. I sent it. I knew, signing it, that I was being stupid. I knew the way you know a thing you have already decided to do anyway. That was Friday. Tuesday I went under. This is the story of what was under there. Saturday morning I went to see Henri Comeau. Henri runs the Comeau Brothers Marina at the north end of Petit Roule. He has run it since 1981. There used to be brothers. There are no longer brothers, but the sign still says Comeau Brothers because Henri has not gotten around to making a new sign, and the old one has held up well in the salt air. I drove the F-150 with a bad transmission and parked it in the dirt lot beside his office, which is a single-wide trailer up on cinder blocks with a hand-painted sign in the window that says "Rods rigged here, bait inside." The screen door has been patched twice with what looks like duct tape. The whole thing leans about 3 degrees off true. Henri was at the counter eating a slice of cantaloupe with a paring knife. He was 81 years old. He had hands like cypress knees and a face the color of strong tea. When I came in, he set the cantaloupe down and wiped the knife on a dish towel and said, "Morning, Theo." I said, "Morning, Henri." He waited. Henri is one of those men who lets you say what you came to say. He doesn't talk first. I said I took a salvage job. I said, up at Devil's Cut. His face did not change. He put the knife down on the counter. He set the dish towel over the cantaloupe. He folded his hands on the counter, the way a banker folds his hands when he is about to tell you something you do not want to hear. He said I said Tuesday. He said, "Who hired you?" I said, "An insurance company out of Port Aubrey, Tidewater Indemnity, a man named Bork." Henri looked at me for a long time. He has eyes that have seen everything you might say to him. He has worked the water since before I was born. He has pulled 12 people out of the bayou over the years, some of them alive. He has not pulled anyone out of Devil's Cut. Nobody has. The bayou holds what it takes from the cut. That is what the old men say at the marina when they think kids aren't listening. Henri said, "Your grandfather went up that cut." I said, "I know." He said, "Your grandfather knew that water. He'd worked it since he was younger than you are now." I said, "I know that too." He said, "And he didn't come out." I said, "No." He said, "The body didn't come out either." I said, "No." He said, "And you're going in." I said, "I am." He looked at his folded hands. He breathed out through his nose. He said, "Theo, you are a grown man. I am not going to tell you what to do. I am going to tell you what I would tell my son if I had a son the age you are. Don't go past the dead cypress." I said, "The dead cypress." He said, "You'll know it. There's one stand of dead cypress about 3/4 of a mile up the cut from the put-in. Big ones. They've been dead my whole life, and they were dead my father's whole life. They mark a place. You go up to them, and you turn around." I said, "The boat has passed them." He said, "I figured it would be." I said, "I need this job, Henri." He said, "I know you do." He didn't say anything else for a while. Then he stood up and walked around the counter and went to a shelf at the back of the trailer. He took something off the shelf and brought it back to me. It was a brass bell about the size of a child's fist with a leather thong tied through the loop. The leather was old and stiff. The bell was tarnished green at the seams. He pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers around it. He said, "Tie this to your line." I said, "Why?" He said, "Tie it to your line, Theo, anywhere above the water where it can ring." And I said, "All right." He said it was my father's. It was his father's before that. They knew about that cut. They had reasons to know. And I said, "Thank you, Henri." He said, "Don't thank me. Bring it back." I drove home from the marina with the bell on the passenger seat. I did not put it in my pocket. I did not want to put it in my pocket. The bell felt like the kind of thing you don't want against your skin until you know what it's for. The road from the marina to the bait shop runs along the south levee for about 3 miles before it cuts inland through stands of pine that have grown up where the sugar cane used to be. There is a bend by an old shut-down filling station with the pumps still standing rusted in their islands. I have driven that bend 10,000 times. There is nothing remarkable about it. I was driving slower than usual. I had the windows down. I could smell the brackish water on the south side and the pine on the north, and a faint thread of wood smoke from somebody burning brush further up. The radio was on a country station out of Port Aubrey that comes in scratchy after about 6 in the evening, but holds clear during the day. There was a song playing I didn't recognize. I came around the bend by the filling station, and there was a dog standing in the road. It was a brown dog, medium-sized, mongrel build. The kind of dog that has been bred by nobody for 10 generations and resembles every other dog around here. It was standing dead center of the road with its head turned to look at me and its tail down. I braked. I stopped, maybe 20 feet from it. The dog did not move. I sat there. I tapped the horn. The dog did not move. I tapped the horn again, longer. The dog did not move. I opened the door and got out. I said, "Hey." I said, "Hey, dog, move on." The dog looked at me. Then it looked past me. It looked at something behind the truck. I turned around. There was nothing behind the truck. The road behind me was empty. The pines stood on both sides, and the road went off straight to a vanishing point, and there was nothing on it. When I turned back, the dog was gone. I want to be clear about this. There was no place for the dog to go. The road was straight in both directions. The pine on either side was thick, but the verge was open ground for 10 feet on each side. The dog could not have gotten into the pine without me seeing it move. The dog could not have run in either direction without me seeing it run. The dog was simply not there. I stood next to the open door of the truck for about half a minute, then I got back in. I drove the rest of the way home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The bell did not ring. I am telling you this because it was the first wrong thing. I did not know it was wrong at the time. I told myself the dog had ducked into the pine while I was turned around and I just hadn't seen it. I told myself I was tired. I told myself it was nothing, which was the wrong thing to tell myself. But I had been telling myself it was nothing for an hour by then, about the call, about the job, about the bell sitting on my passenger seat. So another nothing slotted in easy. Sarah called Saturday evening. I want to say something about Sarah before I get into what she said. Sarah and I were married for 14 years. We have one daughter together. We divorced 4 years ago, not because either of us did anything terrible, but because we had become two people standing in the same kitchen who could no longer find anything to say. She moved up to Port Aubrey to be closer to her sister. I stayed in Petit Roule because the bait shop was here. Camille goes back and forth. Sarah is a kind woman, kinder than I deserved. When she calls me at the bait shop on a Saturday evening, it is for one of 3 reasons. Camille has done something good. Camille has done something bad. Sarah needs something practical from me. She said, "Hey, Theo." I said, "Hey." She said, "Camille told me about the camp." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You take care of the deposit." I said, "I will." She said, "How?" I said, "I took a job." She said, "What kind of job?" I told her about the boat. I did not tell her about Devil's Cut. I told her Bayou Marchand, which is technically true. Devil's Cut is a tributary of Bayou Marchand. I told her Tuesday. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Theo," she said, "is that the cut where your grandfather..." She let the sentence sit. I said, "Yes." She said, "Don't." I said, "I have to." She said, "No, you don't. We'll figure something else. The horseback camp isn't..." I said, "It's not just the horseback camp, Sarah. It's $8,000. She said, "It's the cut where your grandfather drowned." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you're going under in it." I said, "It's 12 feet of water. It's an easy job." She said, "Don't tell me it's an easy job. Don't say that." I knew him too, Theo. I knew him as well as anyone who married into your family could have known him. He said things to me too. I said, "What things?" She said, "About that water." I said, "What about it?" She said, "Never mind. Never mind. I shouldn't. I just..." "Theo, please." I said, "I'll be careful." She said, "You'll be careful." I said, "I will." She said, "You said that when you went under for the Cypress Bend wreck." I said the Cypress Bend wreck was a different thing. She said, "All your jobs are different things until they aren't." I didn't have anything to say to that. She said, "I'm going to put Camille on. Don't tell her about the cut. Don't make her hold that." I said, "I won't." Camille came on a second later. She said, "Daddy?" I said, "Hey, baby." She said, "Mama said you got the deposit money." I said, "I did." She said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure." She said, "For real?" I said, "For real, Cam." She was quiet for a beat. She said, "You sound funny." I said, "I'm just tired." She said, "You'll call me Tuesday night." I said, "I will." She said, "Okay. I love you." I said, "I love you too." We hung up. I sat in the kitchen of the bait shop, which is also where I live, and I held the phone in my hand for longer than I needed to. The bell was on the table in front of me, where I had set it down when I came in. The tarnish on it looked greener in the kitchen light. I picked it up by the leather thong and shook it. It didn't ring. I shook it harder. It didn't ring. The clapper inside moved. I could feel it move, but it did not ring. It was the kind of silence that comes when a bell is full of something that's not supposed to be in a bell. I put it back on the table. I went into the bedroom and lay down with my clothes on. I slept badly. I dreamed of my grandfather walking out of the cypress in his old denim coat with the bayou running off him. He did not look at me. He walked past me toward the bait shop, and I heard him say, "Son," the bayou stopped thinking. I woke up at 3. I did not go back to sleep. Sunday I drove out to my grandfather's old camp. I had not been to the camp since my grandmother died, which was in 2008. The camp had been hers after my grandfather went. She had kept it for the same reason people keep things, which is that letting it go would mean accepting something. When she died, my mother and her brother had argued for 2 years about what to do with it. My mother wanted to sell it. My uncle wanted to clean it up and use it. Neither of them did anything, and eventually my uncle died too, and my mother stopped going down to the bayou at all, and the camp sat. I had a key to the camp because my grandmother had given me one when I was 18. She had said, "You might want to go up there sometime." I never had. The access road from the highway to the camp is 2 miles of crushed shell that washes out every time it rains hard. I drove the F-150 slow. The transmission made the sound it makes. The pine closed in on both sides and then opened up to a clearing about 50 yards across, with the camp at the back of the clearing and the dock running out from the side of it into the cut. The camp was a shotgun house, 3 rooms in a line, cypress board siding gone gray with age, tin roof rusted to copper red. The screen porch had collapsed sometime in the last few years and lay in a heap of splintered wood and bent screen against the side of the house. The windows had been boarded up by my uncle in 2010 or so. The boards were still up. I parked in the clearing and got out. It was a quiet day. The wind was minimal. The sun came down through the pine in long pale bars. There were no birds. I noticed that there were no birds. There should have been mockingbirds and jays and at least a couple of egrets working the cut. There were no birds. I walked to the front door. I tried the key. It worked. The door swung in on a hinge that had not been opened in maybe 15 years and groaned the way old hinges groan. The inside of the camp was hot. The air had been sitting in there for years. It smelled like cypress dust and mouse and the inside of a quilt that has been folded in a chest for too long. The furniture was still in place. The kitchen table with the oilcloth cover, the 2 chairs with woven seats, the cast iron stove, the bed in the back room with a quilt over it that had been my grandmother's mother's, the mantel above the kitchen fireplace with the photographs. I went to the mantel. The photographs were where they had always been. My grandparents on their wedding day, my grandfather in front of a charter boat in 1971 with a marlin laid out at his feet, my mother and her brother as kids on the dock, my grandmother in her garden in front of the camp. There was one photograph I did not remember. It was small, black and white, the size of a playing card. It was wedged into the corner of the frame of the wedding photograph, partially hidden by it. I had not noticed it before because I had never looked at the mantel as an adult. I pulled it out. It was a photograph of 3 men standing in front of a cypress with a string of fish between them. The man on the left was my grandfather, maybe 25 years old. The man on the right was a man I didn't know, short, stocky, in a hat. The man in the middle was older, lean, long beard, sun-cracked skin. He had his hand on my grandfather's shoulder. I turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back in pencil, faded but legible. It said, Beau, Estienne, Lucien, Devil's Cut, 1962. Beau was my grandfather. Lucien was Lucien Aquan, who had run a fish camp downriver in those years and had been my grandfather's best friend. Estienne was Estienne Pelletier. I held the photograph for a long time. My grandfather had known Estienne Pelletier. My grandfather had stood in Devil's Cut with Estienne Pelletier and Lucien Aucoin in 1962, 3 years before my mother was born, more than 20 years before I was born. My grandfather had never mentioned Estienne Pelletier to me. Not once. Not in a story, not in a passing comment, nothing. I put the photograph in my shirt pocket. I walked through the rest of the camp. There wasn't much. My grandfather's tackle was in the back room in a steamer trunk. His clothes had been cleaned out. His pipe collection was on the kitchen windowsill, 6 pipes in a row, dust on all of them. I picked up the third one, which I remembered him smoking the most, and held it. The bowl was burned dark on the inside. There was a faint smell of old tobacco that came up when I held it close. I went out to the dock. The dock was rotten. I did not walk on it. I stood at the end of the clearing and looked at the cut. The cut here was wide, maybe 40 feet across. The water was dark and slow. The cypress leaned in from the far bank and made a low canopy that started about 3 feet above the surface. You could not see far up the cut from where I was standing. The bend started maybe 100 yards up, and the cypress closed off the view. I stood there for a while. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about him standing where I was standing, the morning he went up the cut. I wondered if he had stood here for a long time too. I wondered if he had known what he was going to find. I wondered if Estienne Pelletier had been with him in his head when he untied the pirogue. I went back to the truck. I drove home. The photograph was in my shirt pocket the whole way. Sunday night, I prepared my gear. I want to take a moment on the gear, because the gear is the difference between a salvage diver coming up and a salvage diver staying down, and I have always been precise about it. I dive a Steel 80 tank. I have 2 of them. They were rated last spring. I checked the pressures Sunday night and topped them both off from the fill station at the marina, which Henri had let me use for free as long as I have known him. Steel holds a charge better than aluminum and is heavier underwater, which I like for working salvage where I want negative buoyancy. My regulator is a Sherwood Maximus that I bought used in 2014 and serviced last fall. I tested the second stage on Sunday night by breathing on the bench. It breathed clean. The mouthpiece is wearing a little, but is still solid. My BCD is an old Ziegel Ranger. The dump valves work. The OPV holds at 4 psi. I checked the inflator hose for leaks by submerging the connection in a bucket of water and watching for bubbles. There were no bubbles. My mask is a low-volume single lens. My fins are blue Mare Savantis I have had for too long. My wetsuit is a 3mm that I wear in the summer, when the water is warm enough. The cut in May would be about 75 degrees, which is wetsuit weather for me. My weight belt is 16 pounds, integrated. My lights are 2 Princeton Tech underwaters with new batteries. My knife is a buck stainless on my left calf, in a sheath I have had since I was 20. My line is 50 feet of yellow polypro on a reel, with a brass clip on the end. To this I added, that Sunday night, the brass bell on its leather thong from Henri. I also added something else. I went into my closet and got out a wooden box that had been my grandfather's. The box held things I had not touched in years. Old letters, a pocket watch that did not run anymore, a handful of old coins, and, at the bottom, a small linen pouch that I had never opened. I opened it. Inside the pouch were 5 small pieces of polished black stone, each about the size of a fingernail, each with a hole drilled through the middle. They were threaded together on a leather cord. The cord was dark with age. I had no idea what they were. I had never asked my grandmother about them. They had simply been in the box when my grandmother had given me the box, and the box had sat in my closet for 15 years. I held them in my palm. The stones were smooth. They were heavy for their size. I put the leather cord around my neck. I cannot tell you why. I cannot tell you what I thought they were or what I thought they would do. I can only tell you that I put them around my neck and I felt better with them on than I had felt with them off. The way you feel better with your wedding ring on, even after the marriage is over, because it has been on your hand for so long that the hand misses it. I laid out all the gear on the kitchen floor of the bait shop. I made a checklist on a yellow legal pad. I went through it twice. Everything was there. I went to bed at 10. I dreamed of the dog in the road. The dog was in the road again, but this time when I tried to honk the horn did not sound. I rolled down the window and shouted at it. My voice did not sound. The dog looked at me and opened its mouth, and the inside of the dog's mouth was full of bayou water, and the water was running out of its mouth and onto the road, and the road was filling up with bayou water, and I was sinking in it. I woke up at 4. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the coffee and the photograph from the camp and the bell from Henri and the black stones around my neck. Outside, somewhere on the dock, Gumbo was barking at something. He did not bark often. He barked for a long time. Then he stopped, all at once, the way a dog stops barking when the thing it was barking at has decided to look back at it. I went to the door. I opened it. Gumbo was lying on the dock. He was breathing. He was not asleep. He was watching the water. I said, "Gum, come on, boy." He didn't move. I said, "Gumbo." He didn't look at me. He kept watching the water. I went back inside. That was Monday morning. Monday I did nothing. I sat in the bait shop. I sold 3 packs of frozen shrimp to an old man named Thibault Landry who comes in every Monday, whether he needs shrimp or not. And I sold a 6-pack of beer to a couple of teenagers. I shouldn't have sold a 6-pack of beer to. And I rebuilt one of the reel seats on my charter rod slow just to be doing something with my hands. I called Sarah at 6. I told her I loved her, and I told her to tell Camille I loved her, and I told her if I didn't call by Wednesday morning to call Henri. She said, "Don't talk like that." I said, "I'm just being careful." She said, "Don't talk like that, Theo, please." I said, "Okay." I said, "I love you." She said, "I love you too." We hung up. That was the last time we spoke before the dive. Tuesday I went under. Tuesday morning I was up at 4:30. I made coffee and ate 2 pieces of toast with butter. I fed Gumbo. He ate. He had not gone back to the dock since I had brought him in from there Monday morning. He stayed close to me. He sat under the kitchen table while I ate and put his head on my foot. I loaded the gear into the back of the F-150 at 5. Sunrise was at 6:11 that day. I wanted to be at the put-in by 7 and in the water by 8, which would give me 4 hours of working light before the afternoon storms started building, which they would because they always did in May. The drive from Petit Roll to the put-in for Devil's Cut is 48 minutes if you do not stop. I stopped once, at the Shell station at the crossroads of Highway 22 and Parish Road 9, to gas up the truck and use the bathroom and buy a Coke. The man behind the counter was a thin Vietnamese man I had seen 100 times, and whose name I did not know. He nodded at me. I nodded at him. I paid in cash. When I got back in the truck, the radio came on by itself. It does that sometimes. The radio is a 2008 model and has its issues. The station it tuned itself to was static. Not a station. Just static. I twisted the dial to find something else, and as I did, for about 2 seconds I heard a man's voice come through the static. The voice said Theo. I want to be precise about this. The voice said my name. It said only my name. It did not say anything else. It said Theo, and then there was static again, and then the radio caught a country station out of somewhere, and I had Garth Brooks for the rest of the drive. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself the radio had picked up a snatch of a song where the word being sung happened to be my name. There are songs with the name Theo in them. There aren't many, but there are some. I drove on. The road from the highway to the put-in is unmarked. There is no sign. Locals know it because it is the 3rd gravel cut on the west side of Parish Road 11, past the bridge over Bayou Marchand, where the road bends north. I had memorized it from the maps I had pulled up Sunday night on the bait shop laptop. The gravel cut is wide enough for one vehicle. It runs 3/4 of a mile through Cypress and Tupelo and ends at a clearing the size of a small house lot with a put-in slope into the cut. I came down the gravel slow. The transmission whined. The cypress closed in over the truck, and the morning light went from gold to green to the color of old pond water. The radio lost the country station and went back to static. I turned it off. When I came out into the clearing, my pirogue was already there. I had not put it there. I had hauled it on the trailer behind the F-150. The trailer was behind me on the gravel. I could see it in the rear view. There was a pirogue in the clearing, pulled up onto the slope, the way you pull a pirogue when you are leaving it for a while. It was a cypress pirogue, hand-built, about 14 feet long. The paint was gone in patches. The bow had been repaired with a darker piece of wood that did not quite match. It was my grandfather's pirogue. I am telling you this because I need you to understand what I saw. My grandfather's pirogue had been recovered from this same cut 34 years ago. It had been brought back to Petite Roule and given to my grandmother. After my grandmother died, my uncle had it for a while. After my uncle died, it had been sold to a man named Pierre Babineau, who lives over in St. Marin Parish and who restores old cypress boats as a hobby. Pierre had kept it in a barn. He had restored it. He still owned it. I knew this because I had seen it at his barn 3 years ago when I was passing through St. Marin to deliver a charter party and had stopped to have a beer with him. The pirogue in the clearing was my grandfather's pirogue. I could see the repair to the bow. I could see the pattern of the paint loss along the gunnel, which I had been looking at across the kitchen table from the time I was 4 until the time I was 9. It was sitting at the put-in, pulled up halfway out of the water. I sat in the truck with the engine running and looked at it for a long time. I told myself it wasn't his pirogue. I told myself Pierre had sold it to somebody and that somebody had come down to fish the cut. I told myself there were plenty of old cypress pirogues that looked like my grandfather's. I told myself a lot of things in those few minutes. I got out of the truck. I walked down to the pirogue. I knelt next to it. I looked at the bow repair. It was the same repair. The exact same piece of darker wood, the same nail pattern, the same chisel marks on the inside where someone had cut the new piece to fit. I had stared at that bow repair more than I had stared at most things in my life. There was no one in the clearing. There were no other vehicles. There was no trailer. There was no path through the brush that someone would have walked in from. The clearing was just the clearing and the put-in slope and my grandfather's pirogue sitting at it. I stood up. I walked back to the truck. I sat down in the driver's seat. I closed the door. I called Henri. I held the cell phone to my ear and listened to it ring. There was no service down at the put-in normally, but the call went through that morning, which I should have noticed and didn't. Henri picked up on the 4th ring. He said, "Theo." I said, "Henri." "There's a boat here." He said, "Where?" I said, "At the put-in." "My pirogue is at the put-in." He said, "Your pirogue is in your truck." I said, "No. My grandfather's pirogue, Beau's pirogue. It's at the put-in." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Theo, get back in the truck. Drive home." I said, "It's his boat, Henri." He said, "Get back in the truck. Drive home. I will write you a check for the $8,000 myself. Do you hear me? Theo. Theo, do you hear me?" I said, "I hear you." He said, "Drive home." I said, "I can't." I hung up. I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes. I do not know what I was waiting for. I do not know what I was hoping would happen. After 10 minutes, I got out of the truck. I unloaded the gear. I dragged my own pirogue down off the trailer and into the water. I loaded the gear into it. I tied off the brass bell to the bow line with a clove hitch so that anything tugging the line below would ring it. I checked the bell. It still did not ring when I shook it. I pushed off from the slope. I paddled past the pirogue in the clearing. I did not look at it. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself everything was nothing. And the bayou opened up in front of me. I want to describe the cut as I went up it that morning, because I have been on a lot of water in my life, and what I saw was not the water I expected. The first quarter-mile from the put-in was normal, wide. Cypress on both banks, but not closed in. Slow brown water with a little drift to it. I saw 2 herons fishing in the shallows on the east bank. I saw a turtle on a log. I saw a kingfisher cross from one side to the other and dive and come up empty. Normal cut water. At about the quarter-mile mark, the channel began to narrow. The cypress leaned in. The canopy started to close overhead. The water darkened. This is normal for a cut that runs back into older bayou. The depth doesn't change. The surroundings do. I have paddled into a dozen cuts that look like this, but there were details. The cypress along the banks were old. I expected old. I did not expect ancient. The trees on either side of me had trunks the diameter of station wagons, with knees standing up around them in clusters like crowds at a parade. The bark was darker than cypress bark should be. The Spanish moss hanging from them was so heavy it was almost black, and it hung in long curtains that brushed the water in places. The water itself was darker than the water at the put-in. Not just shadowed darker, the kind of dark that comes from tannin in the water, but more than tannin. The water was the color of strong coffee with milk in it, and as I went further up it lost the milk and became the color of strong coffee. There were no birds. I had seen the heron and the kingfisher and the turtle in the first quarter mile, and then there was nothing. No movement, no splashes, no bird calls. Just the dip of my paddle, and the drip from the blade, and the small wake my pirogue made against the cypress knees. I noticed it about half a mile in. I stopped paddling. I sat still on the pirogue and listened. The silence was complete. There were no birds, no frogs, no insects. There was no wind in the canopy because the canopy was too low and too tight for wind to get into. There was no rustle in the cypress moss. There was no distant traffic sound, no distant generator, nothing. Just the drip from my paddle blade slowing, and then stopping. I sat in the pirogue in the silence for what felt like a long time. Then I picked up the paddle again and kept going. I told myself the silence was the way Devil's Cut had always been. I told myself the locals avoided it because the fishing was poor, because the water was too dark, and the wildlife was thin because the canopy choked it out, and the silence was just the silence of a place with no animals. I told myself, everything is something if you decide it is. At 3/4 of a mile I came around a slow bend and saw the dead cypress. Henri had said you'll know it. He was right. I knew it. There were 5 of them. They stood in a rough line that crossed the cut at an angle, 3 on the west bank in shallow standing water, 2 on the east bank set further back. They were enormous. The biggest was easily 6 feet in diameter at the base. They had been dead so long that all the bark was gone, and the wood underneath was bone-colored, almost white, polished smooth by years of weather. They had no branches. They were just trunks, standing up straight like fingers pointing at the canopy. There was no Spanish moss on them. There was no growth around their bases. The water at their feet was so still it looked like glass. I paddled toward them. The bell on the bowline did not ring as I paddled. I had hit a small wake against a cypress knee 100 yards back, and the bell had not rung then either. I had glanced at it. It was tied tight. The clapper was inside it. It was a working bell. It just did not ring. I reached the dead cypress line. I let the pirogue drift. I sat there. I want to be honest about what I was feeling. I was scared. I had been scared for the last 20 minutes, in the way you are scared when you have committed to something you know you should not have committed to, and the time to back out has passed. Henri had told me to turn around. I had told Henri I would not. I had pushed off from the slope. I had paddled past my grandfather's pirogue. I had paddled into the silence. And now I was at the dead cypress, and the dead cypress were the line, and the line was where you turned around. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes. The $8,000 was on the other side of the dead cypress. The horseback camp deposit was on the other side. Camille's orthodontia was on the other side. The bait shop's freezer compressor was on the other side. The slip lease at Hank Theriot's was on the other side. My grandfather was on the other side. I picked up the paddle. I drew it through the water once. The pirogue glided forward. I went past the dead cypress. The cut on the other side of the dead cypress was not the same cut. I know how that sounds. I know what it sounds like when A man says the water changed after I crossed a line, but I am telling you what I saw. I am telling you what I felt. The water past the dead cypress was deeper. I could not see the bottom anymore. Before, I had been able to make out the silty bottom at 3 or 4 feet down through the dark water. Now there was nothing, just the brown-black depth. The canopy past the dead cypress was lower. It had not changed gradually as I went up the cut. It changed all at once. At the dead cypress, the way a hallway changes when you pass through a doorway. The cypress on either side leaned closer together. In some places the branches touched in the middle. The light coming down through them was the color of old copper. The air past the dead cypress was colder. 5 degrees, maybe more. I felt it on my face the moment I crossed the line. The hair on my arm stood up. My breath, when I exhaled hard, fogged a little. In May, in Louisiana, my breath fogged. The silence past the dead cypress was different too. Silence before had been empty. The silence past the dead cypress was full. I cannot describe this better than that. It was the silence of a room where someone is holding their breath, listening, but you cannot see them. I paddled another quarter mile. The GPS on my belt had stopped updating. I noticed it when I checked it. The screen still showed the map. The marker was still where the marker had been when I left the put-in. The signal indicator showed 0 bars. I shook the GPS. The marker did not move. I clipped it back to my belt and kept going. I came around another bend. There was a pool ahead where the cut widened into a small basin. The cypress around the basin were the same closed-in canopy as the cut, but the water in the basin was glass. No movement, no ripple. The reflection of the canopy in it was perfect. The basin was the spot. I knew it before I checked my coordinates. I knew it because it was the kind of place where a boat would go down and stay down. The bottom was soft here. The basin was sheltered from current. A 38-foot Bertram dropped in here would settle and sit and not move. I paddled into the basin. The bell on the bowline did not ring. I let the pirogue drift to the center. I picked up the small grapnel anchor I had brought for this and lowered it over the side. It went down about 12 feet and caught. I tested the line. It held. I sat in the pirogue and looked down at the water. The water was so dark I could not see my paddle blade 6 inches under the surface. I checked my watch. It was 8:14. I started preparing for the dive. I have done 100 salvage dives. The pre-dive ritual is the same every time. I do it slow. I do it in the same order. I do it without thinking, the way you tie your shoes without thinking, because if you think about it, you skip something. I shrugged into the BCD in the tank. I clipped my weight belt. I checked my SPG. The tank was at 3,000 psi, full. I tested the inflator. The BCD inflated and dumped clean. I checked my regulator second stage one more time, breathing into it on the surface for 10 breaths to confirm the airflow. Clean. I clipped my buck knife sheath to my left calf. I clipped a light to each shoulder strap of the BCD. I clipped my reel to the right side where I could reach it without looking. I checked the bell on the bow line, still silent, still tied. I sat on the gunwale of the pirogue with my fins in my hands. I pulled the fins on. I spit into my mask and rubbed the spit around the lens and rinsed it in the bayou. The bayou water was cold against my hand. I lowered myself into the cut. I want to take a moment here because what I felt when I went into the water was not what I had felt going into water on any other dive. The water was cold, yes, but it was not just cold. It had weight to it. It had the kind of pressure you feel when you step into a quiet room where people have just been talking about you and have stopped. The water was watching me. I know that sounds like a thing a frightened man would say. I am a frightened man in retrospect, but I felt it, and I am telling you what I felt. I held onto the gunwale of the pirogue. I gave myself a moment to adjust. I breathed slow through the regulator. The clicks of the regulator were loud in the silence. I let go of the gunwale. I let the air out of the BCD slow. I went down. 12 feet of water is nothing. 12 feet is a swimming pool. 12 feet is the depth of a shallow well. 12 feet of Devil's Cut on a Tuesday morning in May, with a tank on your back and a job to do, is the inside of the closed hand of God. The visibility was worse than I had expected. I had expected 6 inches. I got 2. I could see my own gloved hand if I held it directly in front of my mask. I could see my dive light beam where it pushed through the silt, a cone of brown about a foot deep before it diffused into nothing. Past that there was no light. There was no horizon. There was only the dark water and the feel of my body in it. I dropped to 10 feet. I paused. I checked my depth gauge. I checked my air. 3,000 psi. I checked my watch. 8:26. I started a slow horizontal sweep with my light. I had marked the GPS coordinates of the wreck against the basin on my map. The wreck should have been about 20 feet east of the center of the basin, where I had anchored the pirogue. I worked east, slow, half-finning. I kept one hand on my reel line, paying it out as I moved. I had gone maybe 10 feet when my left hand brushed against something. I stopped. I held still. I let my breathing slow. I turned my light onto whatever I had brushed. The cone of light fell on a vertical surface, whitish gray, smooth, curved, the hull of the Bertram. I let out a breath. The bubbles came up around me and broke somewhere above. I steadied. I moved closer. I put my hand flat against the hull. It was fiberglass. It was cool. There was a layer of silt on it that came off as fine cloud when I touched it. I started working my way along the hull, hand by hand. Light pointed close, half-finning to drift parallel with it. The hull curved as I went. I was on the port side. I worked toward what I assumed was the stern. I found the rub rail. I found the cockpit gunnel. I felt the curve up over the transom. I came back along the starboard side. I worked my way toward the bow. The boat was upright. The boat was intact. The boat was not on its side. The boat was not broken open. The boat was sitting on the bottom of the basin like someone had set it there on a Tuesday afternoon and walked away. This is not how a boat sinks. A boat that sinks because it has been swamped goes down at an angle. A boat that sinks because it has been holed goes down listing. A boat that sinks because it has been deliberately scuttled goes down with the seacocks open, usually with one corner first, usually with damage you can find. None of those things were true here. The Bertram was sitting on the bottom of Devil's Cut, the way a model boat sits in a display case. I came up along the starboard side toward the cabin. The cabin was the elevated structure forward, with the windshield and the door. The door was the door into the cabin below, small, narrow, with a porthole at face height. I moved up and put my hand on the cabin sidewall. I worked around to the front. I found the door. The door was closed. I put my hand on the handle. It was a marine door handle. I turned it. It moved freely. I pushed. The door did not open. I pulled. The door did not open. I tried sliding it. It did not slide. I checked the seal of the door against the cabin frame. The seal looked intact. The door was not warped. I held my light up to the porthole. The porthole was about 10 inches across. The glass was old plexi, scratched and silted on the outside. I could not see in. I pulled my dive knife from my calf sheath. I used the back of the blade to scrape the silt and the algae off the porthole, working in small sweeps so as not to scratch the plexi. It took maybe 2 minutes. The glass was milky underneath, but I could see through it. I could see into the cabin. I put the light against the porthole, angled so the beam went past my face and into the cabin. The cabin was dark. There were shapes I could not immediately make out. A galley counter, a V-berth at the bow, the chart table on the starboard side. The floor of the cabin was wet. Of course, the cabin was 12 feet underwater. But it was not flooded. The cabin was sealed. I let that sit with me for a moment. The cabin was sealed. A 38-foot Bertram that has been underwater for 2 months in 12 feet of water in a cut would be full of water inside its cabin within the first hour. The water gets in through the air intakes, the cracks, the seals, the head, the engine vents. The cabin floods. The boat goes down. That is how a boat sinks. This boat's cabin was not flooded. I moved my light along the inside of the cabin. I scanned for damage, for a hole, for anything that would explain how the cabin was holding back the bayou. That was when I saw the locks. The locks were on the door I had just tried to open from the inside. I could see them through the porthole. 4 of them, heavy deadbolts, brass-colored, set vertically along the inside of the door, one above the other, 6 inches apart. They were thrown. Each one was thrown into a corresponding bracket on the inside of the door frame. The brackets were heavy. They were old. They had been there for a long time. They were green at the edges, with the same kind of tarnish that was on Henri's bell. I held my light on the locks. I held it there for a long time. A 38-foot Bertram Sportfish does not have deadbolts on the inside of its cabin door. A 38-foot Bertram has a marine sliding door with a single latch. It is a recreational vessel. Recreational vessels do not have brass deadbolts. Recreational vessels do not have brass deadbolts thrown from the inside. I tried to think of any reason a recreational vessel would have brass deadbolts thrown from the inside. I could not think of one. I moved the light further into the cabin. That was when I saw it move. I want to take this slow, because what I saw, I am not sure of, and I do not want to lie about what I saw. The light from my dive light is a cone. It cuts a wedge through the dark. It does not show you a whole room. It shows you what it is pointed at and a little around it. I was holding the light at an angle into the cabin. I was scanning slow. The light had passed the locks on the door. It had moved past the chart table. It had moved across the cabin floor. It had started moving up the wall on the far side of the cabin, the port wall, where the small galley was. Something moved in the light. It was on the floor of the cabin, below the level of the galley counter. It was the size of a large dog, maybe larger. It had been sitting still in the dark, and when the light passed over it, it moved. It shifted. It was not a sudden movement. It was a settling, the way a sleeping person shifts when a covering is pulled off them. I held the light on the spot where I had seen it move. I could not see what it was. The light caught only an edge of something, a curve. It might have been a piece of cloth. It might have been part of a body. The angle of the porthole in the distance and the silt in the water and my own hand shaking made it impossible to see clearly. I stared at it through the porthole. For maybe 30 seconds, it did not move. Again, I started to think I had been wrong. I started to think it had been a trick of the light, a piece of debris, a shadow, my own hand tremor moving the beam in a way that suggested motion where there was no motion. Then it moved again. This time it lifted. It rose up from the floor of the cabin in a slow, upward motion. It was about 3 feet across. It rose to about the level of the galley counter and stopped. It was vertical now. It was facing the porthole. I could not see what it was. It was on the far side of the cabin, and the light beam diffused through the silted water of the cabin before it reached the thing. I could see the outline of it. I could see it had something that might be a head at the top. I could not see eyes. I could not see hands. I could see an outline. The outline tilted slightly. It was looking at me. I want to say something here. The brain does many things to protect itself. The brain rationalizes. The brain reframes. The brain takes ambiguous input and makes it into something familiar. I have read about this. I have experienced it many times in my life. When I am scared, my brain will turn a coat on a chair into a man standing in my bedroom, and then in a second my brain will turn it back into a coat. This is normal. What was in the cabin was not a coat on a chair. What was in the cabin was looking at me through the porthole. I felt it look. I do not have a better way to say this. I felt it. The feeling came down through the water from the porthole and onto my face. It was the feeling of being seen. It was the feeling of being recognized. I dropped the light from the porthole. I pushed off the boat with both hands. I started up. I want to be clear that I did not panic. A diver who panics dies. A diver who panics inflates too fast. comes up too fast, holds his breath against the regulator, gets bent, gets embolized, dies. I knew this. I knew it in my body. I held my breathing. I did not inflate the BCD all the way. I rose slow. I followed my reel line back. I exhaled steady. I kept the regulator in my mouth. I was not panicking, but I was leaving. I was leaving fast. I broke the surface at 8:41. I know because the first thing I did when my head came out of the water was look at my watch. The second thing I did was look around. That was when I saw that the basin had changed. That was when I saw the slack water. That was when I saw the dead cypress were gone. That was when I saw the channel I had come in by was gone. That was when the bell on the bow line of the pirogue, which had not rung the entire morning, started to ring. The bell rang once. It was a clean ring. Brass. The sound a brass bell makes when you strike it sharp with your finger. It hung in the air for a moment and faded into the silence of the basin. I floated in the water and stared at it. The bell was tied to the bowline of my pirogue, 3 feet above the surface. It was not moving. There was no wind. There was no current. The pirogue was where I had anchored it. The line was still tied off. The bell hung from the line. It was still. It rang again. I did not see it move when it rang. I heard the ring. The ring filled the basin. The clapper inside the bell hit the inner wall. It rang the way a bell rings, but the bell did not move. It hung from the line, motionless, ringing. I started swimming for the pirogue. I swam fast. I did not bother to drop my weight belt. I half-dragged myself across the surface of the dark water with my fins kicking under me. I reached the pirogue in 8 or 9 seconds. I grabbed the gunwale. I looked up. I looked around. The basin had become a pond. This is the easiest way I can describe it. The basin where the Bertram lay had been part of a cut, a flowing tributary of Bayou Marchand, with a channel coming in from the south and a channel going out to the north into deeper water. I had paddled in from the south. I had passed the dead cypress, about a quarter-mile back. I had paddled north into the basin. The channels had been there. They had been clearly visible. The water had been moving a little the way bayou water moves. Now there were no channels. The basin was closed. The cypress had moved. They had not moved like trees move in a wind. They had moved like the cypress had rotated in their root sockets, slightly, just enough to close the gap I had paddled through. The dead cypress were not visible. The opening to the south, the way I had come in, was a wall of standing cypress and Spanish moss and dark water. There was no break in it. There was no channel. The opening to the north, where the cut continued, was also gone. The basin had closed. The water in the basin was not moving. It was the stillness I had described before, the stillness of slack water, but more so, the reflection of the canopy on the surface was perfect. The surface looked like a sheet of dark glass laid over the basin. My pirogue floated on it. The ripples I had made swimming were already gone. I held on to the gunwale. I want to tell you what I was thinking, because I do not want to pretend I was thinking nothing. I was thinking the cypress moved. I was thinking it cannot move, and it moved. I was thinking the basin is closed, and I am inside the basin. I was thinking the bell is ringing, and I do not know why the bell is ringing. I was thinking about my grandfather. I want to tell you something about my grandfather. I want to tell you something I have not told anyone, including Sarah, including Henri, including my mother. The night before my grandfather went up the cut for the last time, he came to my house. I was 9 years old. It was late. I was supposed to be asleep. I heard him talking with my father in the kitchen. I came out and stood in the hall. My grandfather was sitting at our kitchen table with a glass of bourbon in front of him. He had not touched it. He was looking at his hands. He looked up when I came into the hall. He saw me. He did not tell me to go back to bed. He said, "Come here, Theo." I went and stood by his chair. He put his arm around me. He held me against his side. He was wearing his work coat that smelled like motor oil and pipe tobacco and cypress dust. He said, "Theo, listen to me. Listen close. I want you to know something." I said, "What, Grandpa?" He said, "I am old." I said, "No, you're not." He said, "I am old enough. There comes a time, Theo. There comes a time when a man has done what he was put here to do. and the doing of it is the rest of his life, and he is at the end of it. I am at the end of it. Do you understand? I said no. He said, I love you. I love your mother. I love your grandmother. I have loved my whole life. Whatever happens, I want you to know I have loved my whole life. I said, okay, Grandpa. He said, you go on back to bed, son. I went back to bed. I heard him leave the house 10 minutes later. The next morning, my father got the call from the marina that they had found my grandfather's pirogue floating empty. I have thought about that conversation every day of my life since. I have thought about what he meant. I have thought about whether he knew he was going to die. I have thought about whether he was saying goodbye to me. I have wanted to ask my mother about it, and I have not asked. I had not put the conversation together with Devil's Cut until I was in the basin that morning, holding the gunwale of my pirogue, with the cypress closed around me and the bell ringing. I put it together then. The cell phone was in the dry bag at the bow of my pirogue. I had put it there before I pushed off from the put-in. I had told Sarah on Monday evening that if I did not call by Wednesday morning to call Henri, I had meant it. I had also meant, at the time, that I would call her Tuesday night when I was back at the bait shop with the $8,000 in my pocket. I dragged myself along the side of the pirogue to the bow. I held the gunwale with one hand and worked the dry bag open with the other. My hand was shaking. I want to be honest about that. I was a man with a shaking hand. I got the bag open. I got the phone out. I pressed the home button. The phone came on. It showed 5 bars of signal. There is no signal at Devil's Cut. There has never been signal at Devil's Cut. There is no signal anywhere within 4 miles of Devil's Cut. I have been around enough men with cell phones in this stretch of bayou to know that the signal cuts out at a particular bend in Bayou Marchand south of the cut, and from there inland you are in dead air. The phone showed 5 bars. I dialed Henri. It rang once. He picked up. He said, Theo. I said, Henri. He said, Theo. Where are you? Are you all right? I said, Henri. The cypress closed behind me. He said, what? I said, the cypress closed behind me. The channel is gone. The dead cypress are gone. He said, where are you? Where, exactly? I said, I am in the basin past the dead cypress. The boat is below me. I went down. I came up. The channels are not where they were. He said, Theo, drop your weight belt. Get into the pirogue. Stay in the pirogue. I am calling the parish sheriff. I am calling the Coast Guard. I am calling everyone I can call. Stay in the pirogue. Do not go back down. Do not go back down, Theo. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? I said, Henri. I said, Henri. You haven't asked me what I went down to look at. There was a pause. The pause was about a second long. In that second I heard, very faintly, behind Henri's voice, the sound of the bell on my bowline ringing. It rang once, low, the way it had been ringing for the last several minutes. The sound was small, the way a sound is small when it has been picked up through a phone. It was the bell ringing where I was standing. It was the bell ringing in the basin. It was coming through the phone. The phone was not connected to Henri. The phone was connected to wherever the bell was ringing, which was where I was, which meant the phone was connected to itself. Henri, said Theo, stay where you are. We are coming. I said, who is we? There was another pause. He said, the men who come for the lock, the men who help with the lock. I said, Henri. I said, Henri, that is not your voice. The voice on the other end of the phone said, it is Henri. Stay where you are, Theo. Stay calm. We are coming. I said, Henri's voice has occasion in it. You have my voice. You sound like me. The voice did not answer for a moment. Then it said, all right. The voice on the other end of the phone became my voice. It was my voice exactly. It was my voice, as it sounds to other people, not as it sounds to me from inside my head. It was my voice, the way I have heard it on a recording, slightly higher than I think it is, with the same pause patterns and the same drag on the long vowels. It was my voice saying, we are coming, Theo. Stay where you are. We are coming for you. It said, do not be afraid. I hung up the phone. I held it in my hand and looked at it. The screen showed the call ended. The screen showed 5 bars of signal. The screen showed the time as 8:43, which was 2 minutes after I had surfaced, which was consistent with the time I had spent on the phone. I called Sarah. I do not know why I did this. I knew I should not. I knew anything I called would not be what I called, but I called her. I called her because she was the person I called when something was wrong, and there is muscle memory for these things. The phone rang. It rang 4 times. She picked up. She said, "Theo?" I said, "Sarah." She said, "Theo." "Where are you? Are you okay?" I said, "Where are you?" She said, "I am at the house." "Why?" "Theo, what is wrong? You sound. Are you hurt?" I said, "Sarah, where is Camille?" She said, "Camille is at school." "She is at school, Theo. It is Tuesday morning. Why? What is going on?" She sounded right. She sounded exactly right. She sounded like Sarah picking up the phone at home on a Tuesday morning with a tone of voice that knew she was about to be told something bad. The tone was right. The pacing was right. The way she said my name was right. I said, "Sarah." I said, "Sarah, what was the song?" She said, "What?" I said, "What was the song at our wedding? The first dance." There was a pause. There was a small pause. It was the pause of someone thinking. The voice on the other end of the phone said it was that Bonnie Raitt song. "Wasn't it?" "Theo, why? Why are you asking me this?" I hung up the phone. The song at our wedding was not a Bonnie Raitt song. There is no Bonnie Raitt song that was the song at our wedding. The song at our wedding was Patty Loveless. It was a Patty Loveless song called "How Can I Help You Say Goodbye," which my wife had loved since she was a teenager, and which we had danced to under a tent in her father's yard in front of 70 people, and which she had been crying through, and I had also been crying, and which was the thing nobody alive but me and Sarah and our daughter knew was our song. The thing on the phone had guessed. It had guessed wrong. I dropped the phone into the water. I watched it sink. The screen stayed lit for a second under the dark surface, and then went out. I held on to the gunwale of the pirogue. I thought about how the thing had known to use Henri's name when it answered as Henri. I thought about how it had known to use Sarah's voice when it answered as Sarah. I thought about how it had known to ask about Camille at school on a Tuesday morning. I thought about how much of my life it had been listening to, and for how long. I thought about my grandfather telling me that the thing in the cabin had been choosing me since I was 6. I thought about how it had been in the bayou, how it had been in the cuts and the channels and the basin behind my grandfather's house, where he had put his finger to the water and said, "Slack water, Theo. Look at it. Remember." I thought about how it had been listening to me through that water. I thought about how it had been listening to all of us through all the water we had touched. I thought about how big the bayou was. I thought about how much water there is in Louisiana and how all of it connects, and about how when you stand on a dock in Petite Roule and put your hand in the bayou, that hand is in water that is also in Pointe-aux-Chenes and St. Marin and the Gulf and the rivers feeding into all of them, about how water is one water even when it is in many places. I thought about how easy it would be for the thing in the cabin to listen to a small boy on a dock in 1989 putting his hand in the water and learn the sound of his name. The hum started after the bell. I cannot tell you when exactly. It started low and rose. It was below hearing at first. I felt it in my chest before I heard it, a vibration in the sternum, the way you feel a bass speaker through a wall. It rose into hearing. It was a low frequency, somewhere between a hum and a moan. It came up out of the water. It came up out of the basin. It came up, I knew, out of the boat below me. The water around the pirogue began to vibrate. Small ripples spread out from the gunwale where I was holding on. The ripples did not spread far. They moved out about a foot and then died. The hum got louder. I want to say something about my grandfather's voice. My grandfather had a voice. He had a Louisiana accent that was a particular kind of Louisiana accent, more French than English in its consonants, with long vowels in places where most accents have short ones, and a way of dropping the last syllable of certain words that I have only ever heard in him and in 2 or 3 other men of his generation. He had a deep voice. He had a slow voice. He had a voice that I have not heard in 34 years, and that I would know if I heard it in a crowd of 1,000 voices. The hum became his voice. It happened slow. The low frequency did not jump into speech. The hum thickened. It took on shape. It separated, the way a single note of a chord separates from the others when you isolate it. And then the shape became words. And then the words were in my grandfather's voice, and the first thing my grandfather said was my name. He said Theo. He said it the way he had said it when I was a child, with the long E, the way he said it when he was sitting at the kitchen table and I came in from outside. Not as a question, as a recognition. I did not move. He said, Theo, listen to me. The voice was coming from below, from the boat, from the cabin with the 4 deadbolts thrown from the inside. The voice was coming up through 12 feet of water and breaking the surface and arriving at my ears the way a voice would arrive at my ears if I were sitting at his kitchen table. He said, I do not have long. The seal is going. I cannot hold it much longer. Listen to me, son. I held the gunnel. I held it tight. My fingernails were dug into the wood. I was breathing through my nose in shallow breaths. I could not speak. I would not have known what to say. My free hand went to my throat. I did not tell it to. It went on its own, the way a hand goes to a wound. The stones were there, under my fingers. The 5 small black stones on the leather cord. They were warm. They had not been warm when I had put them on Sunday night. They were warm now. Warm the way a thing is warm when it has woken up. He said, Theo, you came. I knew you would come. I am sorry. I want you to understand something. I want you to understand that I knew it was him. I was not fooled. I was not confused. I knew that what was in the boat was not him. I knew that whatever was in the boat was using him. I knew this. But I also knew that the voice was his. The voice was his in every detail. The accent, the timbre, the slow way he came down on the consonant of my name. It was him. Whatever else was true, the voice was him. He said, I will tell you the things you need to know. I will tell you fast. The thing that is in here with me has been here 140 years. Estienne Pelletier put it here. Estienne knew it was coming. He knew it would need to be held. He found a way to hold it. The way needs a man. A man has to be the lock. He said Estienne held it for 40 years. When Estienne was old, he came to me. He told me, I have held it since. I do not know how long that has been on the outside. To me it has been a long time. To me it has been 51 years. Time is not the same in here. I was the second lock. There are always 2. The one inside, who holds the cabin sealed, and the one outside, who holds the seal hold. I said no. I want you to know I said no. I said it out loud. I said it into the water. I said no, Grandpa, no. He said, I have held it for 51 years from the inside, Theo. From in here. The cabin holds. The cabin holds while a man holds it. I am not holding it well anymore. I am tired. I cannot hold it anymore. It is finishing me. There has to be another. There has always been another. I said no. He said, Theo, your blood, my blood, Estienne's blood is in this water too. He has a great-grandson who lives in Pointe-aux-Chenes who does not know what his great-grandfather did. The blood is what holds. The blood remembers the lock. He said, I am sorry, son. I did not want this for you. I tried not to let it find you. I held it for 51 years so it would not find you. But it is going to find you now. It is already finding you. The cabin will open in a few minutes. When it opens, what is in here will come out, unless someone takes my place. I said, why me? He said, because you came, son. Because you have my blood. Because Bork called you and you said yes. The thing in the cabin chose you. It has been choosing you since you were 6 years old. It put the pirogue at the put-in. It made the cypress close behind you. It has been making the door of every job you ever took close behind you so that this one would open in front of you. He said, I am sorry. I am so sorry, Theo. I am going to tell you what I felt then, because I think it is important. I felt many things. I felt fear. I felt grief. I felt anger. I felt the particular grief of a man who realizes he has been lied to about the shape of his life for a long time. I felt my grandfather. I felt him with me. I had not felt him since I was 9 years old. I had not let myself feel him. I had not let myself remember him with that kind of presence. I had let him become a story I told about myself. A man who had drowned. A man whose pirogue I had stood next to as a 12-year-old. A photograph on a mantel I had not visited in 15 years. He was there. He was in the water under me. He was speaking to me. He was telling me the truth. He was telling me he had been alive inside that boat for 34 years. I am going to say that again, because the thing that was hardest to make peace with was this. My grandfather had been alive. He had not drowned. He had been inside that boat, holding that thing, for 34 years on my side of the water. Longer than that on his side. Time worked differently in there. He was not a man as I had ever understood a man. He had become the lock. He had become the seal. He had given up his life to be the part of a thing that kept a worse thing from getting out. He was finishing. I felt that too. I felt the tiredness of him. I felt how long his time in there had been, however you counted it. I felt how a man could love what he held against and still want to be done with it. I said, how long do I have to... He said, until the next one comes. Until your daughter has a child, and that child grows old enough to be brought in. The lock has to be replaced before it fails. You will know when. You will feel it. You will feel the new lock coming. You will feel the thing inside choose. And when it chooses, you will be done. I said, how long is that? He said, not as long as you think. He said, time works different in here, Theo. Not slower, not faster. Different. You stop counting it after a while. You hold on, and you hold on. And what feels like 51 years from in here is 34 years on the outside. Maybe less, maybe more. The numbers stop lining up. You let them go. He said, the work is the holding. The holding is the work. After a while, you forget what is being held. You only know that you are holding. I said, what is it? What is in there? He was quiet for a long time. The water around me hummed, but did not speak. He said, I will not tell you. If you choose, you will find out. If you do not choose, you will not need to know. But I will not tell you. You should not have to carry the knowing of it on the wrong side of the choice. I said, okay. I said, okay, Grandpa. He said, Theo, do not feel that you have to. Do not feel obligated. There are two ways out of this for you. You can be the next lock, and the seal holds, and what is in here goes back to being held. Or you can paddle for the south wall and try to push through it. The cypress is solid. It will not let you through. But you can try. You can drown trying. You can fail, and the seal will open anyway, and the thing will come out, and your daughter will see it eventually. Because once it is out, it will find blood. It will find my blood. It will find Estienne's blood. It will find any blood it can use. But you, Theo, will already be dead. You will not be the lock. You will be just dead. He said, I would not blame you, son. I held for 51 years because I am stubborn. I was stubborn before I was sealed. I am stubborn still. I do not know that I would do it again if I had the choice fresh. I do not. If you choose to die in the water, I will love you. Your grandmother loved you. Your mother loves you. Camille loves you. You have been loved, Theo. You will be loved. There is no shame in dying. He said, but if you choose to be the lock, I will love you too. I will love you in here. We will hold it together for a while, until I am done. He said, I am sorry I cannot give you a better choice. The water around me was thick now. It moved against my body. It pushed up through the pirogue, lifting the hull slightly. The hum was louder. The bell was still ringing. The bell rang once every few seconds. on no rhythm I could find. I held the gunwale. I thought about Camille. I thought about her on a horse at the camp she wanted to go to. I thought about her in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10. I thought about her growing up, getting married, having a child of her own. I thought about that child. I thought about the call. I thought about Bork's voice on the phone, or Bork's son's voice on the phone, or whoever Bork became, telling that child about a salvage job. The blood remembers the lock. I thought about the dead cypress. I thought about the cypress closing behind me. I thought about my grandfather's pirogue on the put-in slope. I thought about the bell that would not ring on the way in and was ringing now. I thought about the photograph in my shirt pocket of the 3 men in front of the cypress in 1962. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about him sitting at our kitchen table the night before he came up with the cut for the last time, telling me he had loved his whole life. I had been 9 years old. He had been telling me what he was about to do. He had been telling me he loved me before he did it. I had not understood then. I thought about Sarah saying he said things to me too. I started crying. I do not say this lightly. I am not a man who cries. I had not cried since I was 15 years old at my father's funeral. I cried in the water that morning, holding the gunwale of my pirogue, with my regulator out of my mouth and my mask pushed up onto my forehead in the dark water of the closed basin around me. I cried for my grandfather, I cried for Camille, I cried for myself. I said, okay. I said, okay, Grandpa. He did not answer for a moment. Then he said, Theo, are you sure? I said, no. I said, no, I am not sure. I said, but I am going to do it anyway. He said, son. He said, son, I am so sorry. I am so. I love you, son. I said, I love you too, Grandpa. I said, how do I? He said, come down. The cabin will open for you. Come in. Lock the door behind you. The locks will throw when you are inside. You will not need to do anything. The seal will know you. The seal will take you. He said, you do not need to take your tank. You will not need it. I sat in the water, holding the gunwale, for maybe a minute longer. I thought about calling Sarah. I thought about calling Camille. I thought about saying goodbye. I knew I could not. I knew the cell phone in the dry bag in the pirogue would not have any signal. I knew that even if it did, I could not tell either of them what I was about to do. I could not give that to them. I thought about Henri, about what Henri would do when I did not come back. I thought about the $8,000, about how Bork's check would not come because there had never been a Reynolds and there had never been a boat owned by an estate, and Tidewater indemnity probably did not exist. And Bork was something I did not understand and would not understand. I thought about the deposit on Camille's horseback camp. I took the photograph out of my shirt pocket. The water had gotten to it. The edges were soft. I looked at the 3 men in front of the cypress in 1962. My grandfather, 25, his arm around a man with a beard. Estienne Pelletier, who had held this thing for 40 years before my grandfather. Lucien Aquan, my grandfather's best friend who had not known. I put the photograph back in my shirt pocket. I let go of the gunwale. I put my regulator back in my mouth. I pulled my mask down. I picked up my dive light. I let the air out of the BCD. I went down. The water held me on the way down. That is the only way I know how to say this. The water held me. It was not buoyant exactly, and it was not heavy exactly. It was attentive. The water around me had become aware that I was going down, and it adjusted around my body to slow my descent, the way a person who is helping a sick man across a room adjusts under his weight. I sank past 3 feet, past 5, past 7. The dark closed around me. My dive light was still on, clipped to my BCD strap, but I did not need it for orientation anymore. I knew the way. I had been here once already. I followed the reel line I had left, hand over hand, paying it back through my fingers as I went down. I want to tell you what I was thinking on the way down. I was thinking about my truck. I had parked the F-150 in the clearing at the put-in. I had left the keys in the ignition. This was not a thing I usually did. I usually pocketed the keys. I do not know why I had left them. Maybe because the clearing was empty. Maybe because I had been distracted by the pirogue that was not mine, that was my grandfather's. Maybe because some part of me, already, on Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, had known I was not going to come back to the truck, had wanted to leave the keys where they could be found. I thought about who would find the truck. I thought about Henri driving up the gravel cut 3 days from now, after Sarah had called him. I thought about him standing in the clearing alone, with the pirogue still there, and my truck still there, and the keys in the ignition. I thought about him standing there for a long time. I thought about him not crying, because Henri did not cry, but standing the way a man stands when he has just paid for something he did not want to buy. I thought about Camille at school, about how she was probably in math class, about how she had a math teacher named Mrs. Boudreau, who was no relation, but who Camille had picked because Camille was a kid who liked the small coincidence of sharing a name with a teacher, about how Mrs. Boudreau would tell Camille's mother much later that Camille had been a serious student and had been kind to other students, and had told Mrs. Boudreau once that her father ran a bait shop and her father was a quiet man who loved her. I thought about the things I would not see. I thought about her on the horse at the camp she had been so excited about. I thought about her at her high school graduation. I thought about her at 20. I thought about her at 30. I thought about her with a child of her own, holding that child, and feeling whatever I had felt holding her when she was new and small, and the weight of her had not yet decided what kind of weight it was going to be. I thought about her child, about the way the lock works, about how, when that child was old enough, the bayou would reach for them, about how I would feel it from inside the boat, about how I would have to let it find them. I thought about how I would not let it. I was already thinking, as I sank past 9 feet, about how to make sure the thing in the cabin did not find Camille's child, about how I would hold on past my own ending if I had to, about how I would not be tired. I would not be like my grandfather, who had held longer than any man should have been asked to hold, and had become tired, and who had let the thing reach for me. I made a promise to myself, in the water. I made a promise to my unborn grandchild. I made a promise to Camille, who was at school in Port Aubrey, not knowing. I would not pass the lock. I would hold it. I would hold it until something else came along that could take it from me. Something that was not blood. Something that was not love. Something that had no daughter and no granddaughter and no grandfather. I would wait for that thing, however long it took, and I would give it the lock, and then I would be done. I do not know if such a thing exists. I do not know if the lock can be given to a stranger, but that is what I decided on the way down. I am still deciding it. Past 10 feet, past 11. I felt the boat under me before I saw it. I felt the curve of the hull. I put my hand down. It met fiberglass. I steadied myself. I worked along the hull toward the cabin. The reel line was still in my hand. I did not need it. I let it pay out behind me as I went. It would not matter where the line ended up. I would not be coming back along it. The cabin was open when I reached it. The 4 deadbolts had withdrawn. The door was ajar by maybe 6 inches. The interior of the cabin was dark. The hum that had been coming up through the water was now lower and quieter. It was waiting. I held the door handle. I pulled the door open. I looked into the cabin. What I saw, I will tell you as best I can. I will tell you what I saw, not what I think I saw. I will tell you what was in the cabin. The cabin was the cabin of a 38-foot Bertram Sportfish. The galley was on the port side. The chart table was on the starboard side. The V-berth was forward. In the V-berth there was a man. He was sitting upright in the V-berth. He was old. He was very old. He was older than my grandfather had been when I had known him, but I knew him. The thin shoulders, the shape of his head, the set of his hands on his knees. He was looking at me. He was smiling. The smile was the smile I remembered from when I was a child. The small, soft smile that was the only smile he had. The smile that came up at the corner of his mouth when he was looking at something he loved. He said, "Come in, Theo." I went in. I let myself drift through the door. I came into the cabin and stood, waited on the cabin floor. The cabin was dry. I want to be clear about that. The cabin was dry. There was air in the cabin. I could feel air on the parts of my face that were not under my mask. The wet of the bayou ended at the cabin door, and the inside of the cabin was a room, with air in it and a man sitting in the V-berth looking at me. He held out his hand. I went forward. I took my regulator out of my mouth. I set my dive light on the chart table. I dropped my fins on the floor. I sat down on the edge of the V-berth. I took his hand. His hand was warm. It was the warmth of a hand. It was the warmth of my grandfather's hand when I had been 9 and he had put his arm around me at our kitchen table and told me he had loved his whole life. He said, "You came." I said, "I came." He said, "I am so glad to see you." I said, "I am so glad to see you, Grandpa." He pulled me toward him. I let him pull me. He put his arms around me. He was light. He was lighter than a man should be. He was the weight of a memory. But he was there. He held me. He said, "It does not hurt, son." I said, "Okay." He said, "It is just the holding. After the holding starts, it does not hurt." I said, "Okay." He pulled back enough to look at me. He looked at my face for a long moment, like a man checking to see whether his grandson had grown the way he had thought his grandson would grow. His eyes were the eyes I remembered. The gray-blue eyes my mother had inherited and that I had not. He said, "You got tall." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Your mother. How is your mother?" I said, "She is good. She lives in Lake Charles now. She got remarried about 15 years ago. He is a good man. He treats her well." He said, "Good. That is good." He said, "And Sarah?" I said, "We are not married anymore, Grandpa." He was quiet a moment. He said, "I am sorry to hear that." I said, "It is all right. She is a good woman. We have a daughter. Her name is Camille. She is 12. He said, "Camille." I said, "Yes." He said, Is she like you?" I said, "I think she is more like Sarah. She is quiet. She watches before she speaks. But she has my mother's chin." He smiled. He said, "I would like to have known her." I said, "I know." He said, "I would have. If I had been able to, I would have." I said, "I know, Grandpa." He was quiet for a long time after that. I could feel him fading. He was not getting smaller or less solid. The shape of him was the same. But the presence of him was thinning, the way a smoke thins in a still room after the fire has gone out. He had used something up to come and meet me, and he was using up the last of it now, sitting with me. He said, "Theo." I said, "Yes." He said, "The thing in here, with us." I said, "Yes." He said, "It does not have a name. It did not come from a place that has names. Estienne did not know what it was. Estienne only knew it was here, and that it would come out, and that it needed to be held." He said, "When you start holding it, you will feel it. You will feel it the way you feel a fish on a line. It will be there. It will pull. It will not stop pulling. The pulling is the holding. As long as the line stays in your hand, the seal stays." I said, "How do I keep the line in my hand?" He said, "You decide to. Every day. Every hour. Sometimes. You will know what an hour is in here for a while. You will lose track of it after that. After you lose track of it, the deciding is the easier part. It becomes what you are." He said, "The hard part is when you start to forget who you were before you were the line." I said, "How long?" He said, "I cannot tell you how long. Time is not the same. But the day comes when you cannot remember the smell of your wife's hair. The day comes after that when you cannot remember your wife's name. After that, the rest goes. Slow. Some of it stays longer. Camille will stay. Your daughter will stay. The love does not go. The names go. The faces go. The love stays. That is the thing. The love is what you hold the line with." I said, "Okay." He said, "I held your face for 51 years. I held it because I knew you would come. I did not know when. I knew you would. The love kept it sharp." He said, "I want you to know. I held your face. I held your name. The whole time. I started crying again. He held me while I did. I cried into the front of his work coat that smelled like motor oil and pipe tobacco and cypress dust, the same way it had smelled when I was 9, exactly the same. I cried for a long time. He did not say anything. He held me. He breathed slow against the top of my head, the way an old man breathes when he is holding a child who is sad. When he pulled back, he saw the stones. They were around my neck, the leather cord, the 5 small, polished black stones I had found in his box in my closet on Sunday night and put on without knowing why. He looked at them. He reached up and touched one with the end of one finger. He said, "You found them." I said, "In your box, in the linen pouch at the bottom." He said Estienne made them. He gave them to me the day I took the lock. 5 stones, one for each lock to come. The lock wears them when the lock is awake. I wore them in here for a long time. Your grandmother put them back in the box after I went under. She knew what they were. She left them for you. I said, "For me?" He said, "For whoever came." He touched the stones again. They were warm under his finger. I had not noticed they were warm. They had been warm the whole time, maybe. I had not been paying attention. He said, "The stones know the cabin. They will know you. When the door closes, the stones will know." I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you ready, son?" I said, "No." I said, "But go on." He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too, Grandpa." I felt the door close behind us. I heard it. I heard the 4 deadbolts throw. They threw one at a time, from the top of the door down. Clack, 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 clack. The cabin was sealed. I did not turn to look. I held my grandfather. He held me. The cabin was dark. The hum was gone. The water on the outside of the boat had stopped moving. Somewhere up above, in a place that was already starting to feel far away, the dead cypress were settling back into where they had always been. The channels were opening back up. The basin was returning to its place in the cut, and the bayou was beginning to think again. I do not know how long I sat there. I am still sitting there, in a way. I am the lock. I have been the lock since Tuesday. I have been the lock for a long time, if you count the way time works in here. I am holding. It is dark, and it is quiet, and my grandfather is here, what is left of him. Fading the way I have been told. The lock fades, over time. He is going. He has held for a long time. He gets to go now. I will hold the rest. I will hold until my granddaughter is old enough. I want to tell you one more thing, because the story is not done up above. Up above on Tuesday morning, after I had gone down, the basin closed. The bell on the bowline of my empty pirogue stopped ringing. The cypress settled. The cut became the cut again. The water flowed slow. My pirogue sat in the basin overnight before anyone came looking. Sarah had waited for my call on Tuesday night. When it did not come, she tried me at the bait shop and got no answer. She tried again Wednesday morning. Nothing. She called Henri at the marina at 1 in the afternoon on Wednesday. Henri picked up on the second ring. He had been waiting for her call. He said he would drive up to the cut. Sarah said she was coming. He said, "Do not come up. Stay where you are. Stay with Camille. I will call you." She said, "Henri." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is he?" Henri said, "I do not know. I am going up." Henri drove up Wednesday afternoon. He drove the old gray Ford he had been driving since 2002. He came down the gravel cut to the clearing slow. He pulled in beside my F-150, which was parked exactly where I had left it, with the keys still in the ignition. He sat in his truck for a few minutes before he got out. He walked to my truck. He opened the door. The keys were in the ignition. My phone charger was plugged into the cigarette lighter. My wallet was on the passenger seat. My dive logbook was on the dash. Nothing was missing. The truck looked the way a truck looks when a man has gotten out of it intending to come right back. Henri took the keys out of the ignition. He locked the truck. He put the keys in his pocket. He walked down to the put-in. The pirogue I had unloaded from the trailer was gone. Of course, I had paddled it up the cut. The trailer was still there. The other pirogue was also still there. My grandfather's. The one that had been there when I arrived. It was sitting on the slope where it had been, with the bow half out of the water. Henri looked at it for a long time. He walked back to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat. He took out his phone. He called the parish sheriff. The sheriff sent a team Thursday morning. The team was 4 men. They knew Henri. They had worked with him before on a recovery in 2016 of a man who had gone over the side of a charter boat near Pointe aux Chênes. They came down the gravel, cut in 3 vehicles. They unloaded an aluminum base boat. They put it in at the slope, next to the pirogue that nobody could explain. They went up the cut. They found my pirogue in the basin. They found the dive line going down into the water. They followed the line. One of them, a deputy named Mike Thibodeau, who had been a Navy diver before he was a deputy, put on his gear and went down with another deputy as safety. They found my BCD and my tank and my fins on the bottom of the basin in a loose tangle, the way gear settles when it is not on a body anymore. They followed the line further. The line ended in a frayed cut, 3 feet from the silhouette of the Bertram. Mike came up. He said it was the boat. He said the boat was sealed. He said he had tried the door. He had tried to break a porthole with the back of his knife. The plexi would not break. He had felt the door under his hand. He had felt the locks under the door. He had felt how solid they were. He said it was the strangest dive of his life. He said he wanted off it. They tried again on Friday with bigger tools. A pry bar, a hammer. The pry bar bent against the door. The hammer did nothing. The door did not move. The locks did not give. On Saturday, the sheriff called Sarah. He said, Mrs. Boudreau, we have not recovered him. We have not recovered the boat. We are going to suspend the active search. We will keep the case open. If anything changes, we will let you know. Sarah said, okay. She thanked him. She hung up the phone. She sat in her kitchen for a long time. Camille came in at some point. Camille was 12. Camille had been told her father had been in a diving accident. Camille had been told they had not found him yet. Camille knew, the way 12-year-olds know things they are not told, that they would not. Camille sat down at the kitchen table across from her mother. She said, Mama. Sarah said, yes. She said, I want to go to the bait shop. Sarah said, okay. They drove down to Petite Roule that afternoon. Henri was at the bait shop. He had been there for 2 days. He had been feeding Gumbo. He had been sleeping on the cot in the back room. He did not say much when Sarah and Camille came in. He hugged Sarah for a long time. He knelt down and hugged Camille. He told them where I kept things. He told them about the freezer compressor that was about to go. He told them about the slip lease at the marina that I had been behind on. Camille walked around the bait shop. She touched things. She picked up a tackle box and looked inside it. She set it down. She went into my kitchen, which was where I lived. She looked at the kitchen table. The brass bell was there, where I had left it. The leather thong was looped around it. She picked it up. She held it. It rang in her hand. It rang once, soft. The clapper inside moved. The sound was small. It was the sound of a small bell in a small kitchen. Henri saw it. He came into the kitchen. He said, Baby, put that down. She said, Why? He said, Please. Please put it down. Please put it back on the table. She put it back on the table. Henri picked it up. He held it for a moment. He set it on a high shelf above the kitchen sink, where Camille would not be able to reach it without standing on a chair. Then he took it down again. He looked at Sarah. He said, I want to take this with me. Is that all right? Sarah said yes. Henri said, I would like to come over to your house. Tomorrow. I want to talk with you about some things. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She said, all right. Henri left with the bell. I do not know what he told her. I do not know how much of it she believes. I know she has called Camille every night since. I know she has not let Camille go anywhere near the water alone. I know she has talked to Henri 3 or 4 times. I know Henri has been to her house twice. I know he has talked with her in her kitchen, with the door closed, while Camille was watching television in the living room. I know Camille had bad dreams for a long time. I know she would not eat for a while. I know she did not go to the horseback camp in July. Her mother said no. Her mother said, next year. Camille did not push back. I know Camille still believes I am alive somewhere. She is not wrong. After 3 weeks, my mother had a memorial service for me in Petit Roule. Sarah came, Camille came, Henri came, half the marina came. Thibault Landry came, who came to the bait shop every Monday whether he needed shrimp or not. Lucien Alquan's grandson came, although I had only ever met him twice. Pierre Babineau came from over in Saint-Marin with his hat in his hands. They put a stone in the family plot next to my grandfather's empty stone. They said the words. They went home. That night, Henri sat on the porch of his single-wide trailer at the Como Brothers Marina with the brass bell on the railing beside him. He sat there until 2 in the morning. He did not drink. He did not smoke, even though he had been a smoker for 60 years. He looked at the bayou. He talked to my grandfather a few times that night. He did not say anything out loud. He talked to him the way men talk to men they have known a long time who have died. He told him he was sorry he had not stopped me. He told him he had tried. He told him he was going to keep an eye on Camille. He told him he would do what he could for as long as he could. He did not know that I was hearing him. I am hearing him. The water carries voices in here. In here is a different kind of place. I am hearing him. I am hearing Camille at night when she lies in bed at her mother's house and talks to me in her head before she sleeps. I am hearing Sarah every morning when she stands at her kitchen window and looks at the backyard and does not say anything but is thinking about the marriage we had and about whether there was anything she could have done to make a different version of me. I am hearing my mother. I am hearing Henri. The love stays. My grandfather was right. The love is what you hold the line with. The names will go. The faces will go. Some of them have already started to go. I cannot remember exactly what my mother looked like when I was 20, even though I could remember it last week. I cannot remember the song that played in the truck on the drive to the cut, even though I could remember it on the way down. The forgetting is starting. The forgetting will keep going. But I will remember Camille. I am holding the line. The line is in my hand. The pulling has started. The thing in the cabin is real. It is here with us. It is pulling at the line. I cannot tell you what it looks like because, in the dark of the cabin, it is not exactly looking like anything. But it pulls. It is patient. It has been pulling for 140 years. I will hold longer than it can pull. I have to. After 4 weeks, on a Friday afternoon, a phone rang in an office in Port Aubrey. The office was small. There was a single desk and a single chair. There were no files in the cabinet behind the desk. There was no computer. There was a beige cradle phone wired into the wall. There was a man sitting in the chair. He was the kind of man who looked like he had always been sitting in the chair. He was tall. He was thin. He had hands like a piano player. He had no name that anyone knew, although on certain phone calls he had used the name Marsh Bork. The phone rang. He picked it up. He said yes. He said, "Is this Pelletier?" He said, "The man I am looking for is named Auguste Pelletier. He lives in Pointe-aux-Chênes. He is a fishing guide. His great-grandfather was a man named Estienne Pelletier. Am I speaking to Auguste?" He listened. He said, "I have a salvage job for you. A 38-foot Bertram sportfish, 12 feet of water up the southwest fork of Bayou Marchand in a tributary called Devil's Cut. The pay is $8,000 for a successful raise, $4,000 for a documented attempt." He listened. He said yes. "I understand. Take your time. Call me back." He hung up the phone. He sat in the chair. He looked at the wall. The window of the office was open a little. Outside, in the late afternoon, there was the sound of cypress moving in a light wind, and the sound of water lapping at a piling somewhere out of sight, and the sound of a bell on a line, rung soft by the wind, faint and tarnished and patient. He waited.